All right, today we're going to do a little bit of detective work. We're diving into the New Testament, but maybe not in the way you're used to. We're not talking about faith exactly. We're looking at it as a collection of ancient documents. So what are the real nuts and bolts here? How did these incredibly influential texts actually come to be? Let's get into it. And we're going to start with a question that seems pretty simple, right? What language did Jesus and his disciples actually speak, like day to day? The answer, well, it's our first big clue in this whole investigation. And honestly, it might not be what you think.
See, before you can get to the message, you got to understand the medium, the words themselves. The original languages of the Bible, they are the bedrock, the absolute foundation for everything else.
And it really boils down to this number, 3. The entire Bible, as we know it, was originally written in just 3 core languages. And these are the building blocks for our whole investigation.
Okay, so let's break these 3 down. You've got Hebrew, right? That's the ancient language of the Old Testament. Then there's Aramaic, which was kind of like the street-level, everyday language in 1st century Judea. And then you have Koine Greek. Koine just means common. This was the language of the Roman Empire, the one everybody used to communicate. And here's the kicker. The entire New Testament was written in this common Greek.
So think about that for a second. The Gospels are written in Greek, but they're telling the story of a man, Jesus, who almost certainly spoke Aramaic. And what's so cool is that sometimes the authors who were writing in Greek, they left in these little fragments of Aramaic. They're like these amazing linguistic fossils just embedded right there in the text.
So for instance, in the Gospel of Mark, there's a story where Jesus heals a young girl. He takes her by the hand and says, Talitha Kumi. And the author leaves that Aramaic in and then immediately translates it for his Greek readers, little girl arise. It's this moment that just feels so incredibly immediate, so personal,
And then you have maybe the most famous one of all, this incredibly raw, powerful cry from the cross that's recorded in Matthew's Gospel, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. Again, that's Aramaic, preserved word for word inside a Greek text. It's like a little window that opens up and lets us hear the sounds of the 1st century.
Okay, so we've got the language down. Now let's zoom in on the documents themselves, the books that actually tell the story of Jesus. It's time to talk about the Gospels. First off, what does that word gospel even mean? Well, it actually comes from Old English, Godspell, which literally just means good news. And that's a direct translation of the original Greek word they were using back then, euangelion. But here's where it gets really interesting. Back in the 1st century, that word euangelion was kind of flexible. It could mean the message Jesus himself was preaching, or it could mean the message that the first Christians were preaching about him. It could even be both. And eventually, it came to mean the specific written books about his life that we read today. That flexibility is super important to remember.
And that brings us to the real heart of our investigation today, something that scholars call the Synoptic Puzzle. It's this fascinating literary mystery that people have been debating for centuries, and it's all about how the first 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, relate to each other.
So the word synoptic, it's from the Greek synoptikos, and it literally means seeing together. And that's exactly why we call Matthew, Mark, and Luke the Synoptic Gospels, because you can literally put them in columns side by side and see them together. And when you do, you notice some really startling things.
And I don't just mean they tell some of the same stories. I mean they share a shocking amount of identical text. We're talking the exact same Greek words in the exact same order for whole sentences at a time. Now that suggests way more than just people remembering the same events. It points to a direct literary connection. Someone was copying someone.
So here's the puzzle in a nutshell. You have Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They often follow the same exact structure. They tell the same stories in the same order, and they use identical vocabulary. It's just undeniable that they are literally dependent on one another. And scholars call this whole thing the synoptic problem. The big question is, who was copying from whom?
Now, to even begin to solve a puzzle like that, we need another piece of the board. We need a timeline. When were these documents actually written? This is where the real detective work comes in, trying to date these ancient texts.
So what have scholars figured out? Well, the general consensus, and this is pretty solid, is that the 4 Gospels were all written somewhere between 65 and 100 CE. Now think about what that means. They weren't written down on the spot by eyewitnesses watching it happen. They were written decades later by a 2nd or even 3rd generation of believers.
And you can see here how the evidence starts to stack up.
After that 65 to 100 CE window, you start to see other writers mention the Gospels. Early church leaders like Papias around 125 CE, and then Irenaeus around 180 CE, they start quoting from them and even naming them. This is what we call external evidence. It lets scholars work backward and build a solid case for that timeline. So basically, scholars are working with two main types of clues. You've got that external evidence we just talked about, other ancient writers quoting the Gospels, but then you also have internal evidence. These are clues inside the text themselves. You know, like a reference to a major historical event, like the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 CE. That can help you nail down a date.
Okay, so let's pause and take stock. We've looked at the languages, this wild literary puzzle of who copied whom, and the time frame they were written in. So, what does it all mean? What are these books? Are they history? Are they theology? Or are they something else entirely?
And this right here, this is probably the single most important takeaway from our whole investigation. The Gospels are not biographies, at least not in the way we think of biographies today. They are not trying to be objective, minute-by-minute historical records. They are a totally different kind of writing.
So, okay, if they're not modern biographies, then what are they? Well, they're kind of their own unique thing. Think of them as proclamations of faith. They were shaped by decades of people telling these stories out loud, oral tradition, before anyone wrote a single word down. They weave together historical memories with theological meaning, and they were written to help specific communities with their specific problems.
And that really leaves us with the big question, doesn't it? Knowing all this, that these are ancient texts translated from one language into another, that they are borrowing from each other, that they were written as proclamations of faith and not modern history, how does that change the way we read them today? What does it mean for us now?